In this video you are going to learn how to post-process your interior scenes in Unreal Engine 4. Now let's get right into the video. Firstly, you must know how the post-process works, but if you don't, make sure to watch this recent tutorial on post-processing which goes in depth with most of the important settings. Then come back and watch this one. Here are the main settings you will 99% of the time change. Bloom. This is a very situational effect you may or may not want to add, more on that in a bit. Exposure. Under or overexposing a scene or image can ruin it, you must be careful at how you set its values. Image effects. That means vignette and grain. Color grading, for when you need that little bit of saturation or contrast. Lastly, ambient occlusion. Now that we got that down, let's get in an interior scene and see how I would post-process it from scratch. So this is going to be the scene that we are going to work on. So let's start and go to lens, and the first thing that we are going to change is bloom. First of all, with bloom I always like to just go very high and then very low and see how this changes. For this particular scene it really depends on what you want to achieve. If you want to achieve something that looks washed out, then you can go with a high value. And don't get me wrong, that can look super good, and let's see how we can achieve that. So I'm going to set the intensity to something very high like 3, and then I'm going to go to exposure, and for the minimum and maximum brightness I'm going to set this to something super dark like 1. And you can see how we achieved a very nice mood. The house is very dark, while the outside is very bright, giving a very dramatic look to it. But if you want something cleaner, you go with a low value. I think somewhere around 0.275 should be fine. Going back to bloom, we can also change the method from standard to convolution, which is going to give this cinematic look. You might not want to use this in games because it's too expensive, but for a scene or cinematic this is going to look great. Now let's go to exposure, and here what I like to do is always set for the minimum and maximum brightness the same value. So for this one what we just have to do is to go and try some values like let's say 1. 1 is a bit too dark, but since we are going for a realistic scene, let's go with something that is going to be bright everywhere. So let's say 0.5, let's see how that looks. This could work, but I think maybe 0.25 should be even better, and that should do it. As well, if you want to have different exposure values in different parts of the scene, you can have 2 different values, and then you can also play around with the speed up and speed down. There are various reasons of why you would want to have a different minimum and maximum brightness. For example, if this was to be a room and not just a door, you could change the brightness in there while keeping the same brightness in this room. This is a pretty particular case, which unfortunately I can't show in this video, but that should be pretty easy to figure out for yourself. Chromatic aberration is a very big deal. It can make or break the scene. For example, in this one, if you were to add chromatic aberration, it would look pretty bad. And let me show you why. Sure, right now the difference isn't very big with 0.3, but it ruins that clean look of the scene. You can especially see that on this door frame, and as well right here. By making this 0 again, it is going to have that clean, crisp look. So for that reason I am not going to have any chromatic aberration. The dirt mask is a way to simulate dirt on the screen when looking into a light. Personally, I'm not a very big fan of dirt masks, so I usually don't use them, and especially in interior scenes they aren't very good to use. Let's skip the camera tab, because this is dependent on the exposure metering mode, and you can only access this if you have it set to manual. But we are not going to use this for today's video, so let's change it back to histogram. For lens flares, this is something I usually avoid adding, but it could work well for this scene. So let's turn on the settings and see what we are going to change. First of all, this is too intense, so I'm going to go with something like 0.02, maybe 0.01. Then let's also increase the size, and I'm happy with that. I think that looks pretty good for lens flares. Alright, let's close this down and let's go to image effects. The vignette is a very good effect to focus on an object. So I think turning this up is usually a very good idea. By default this is 0.4, so I'm going to go with 0.55. You can already see how the corners of the screen are darker than the center. For grain jitter and grain intensity, I usually set this to their maximum value and then go down until it feels just right. So let's go with grain intensity and see just when this is barely visible. Maybe just a bit more, and that should be it. And I'm also going to lower the grain jitter. Grain is a great way to add a bit of realism to your scene. And besides that, it also adds a little bit of color variation, especially in stuff like walls and other objects that have flat colors. So I guess that's a plus. As for the depth of field, usually a house isn't big enough for you to need to use depth of field, but of course if you, let's say you have a camera here and you want to blur this kitchen, you could go ahead and try to blur it. I'm not going to do that for this scene because this is basically a single room and that wouldn't make too much sense. Now let's go on to color grading. First and foremost, I think this scene could use a little bit more saturation, so I will set this value to 1.2. As well, I'm going to go to contrast and set this to 1.05, just a little bit more. And then something I always like to do is to go to gain and set this to 1.2 as well. So now we have a little bit better contrast and saturation in the scene. Usually what I do for some scenes like this one is to go to shadows, saturation, and see how it looks with zero saturation on the shadows. And I think this still looks good, but I like it more with some saturation in it. So let's just leave it as it is. And that's pretty much everything for color grading. We could also play around with the film settings, but I like how this is currently looking, so I'm not going to change this. Lastly, let's go on to rendering features. First and foremost, what I always do is to go to ambient occlusion, advanced, and then go to quality and crank this up to 100. For small scenes like this, it is fine, it is not going to impact the performance that much. And since this is not a game, it doesn't matter anyway. Then what I do is to go to intensity, enable this and start playing around with this until I get something that I'm happy with. And for this particular scene, I think that the default value is actually good, which is actually surprising. Okay, let's close this down. And let's go to reflections. Now, if you are like me and you don't have an RTX card, you cannot use ray tracing. But we can still adjust the screen space reflections so they look better. So let's enable intensity, quality and maximum roughness, and the change is going to be very visible in this television and picture. So just look at this picture when I turn up the quality to 100. You can see just how much better it looks. And then if I turn the maximum roughness to 1, it is going to look the best with screen space reflections. Let's close this down, and that's it for reflections. Lastly, what we can do is go to misc, screen percentage, and set this to 200. Now you won't see any difference because I have to change this from here, then go to screen percentage and set this to 200, and you can see just how much crispier everything looks. Now this is going to cost a lot of performance, so never use something like this in a game, and be careful with how high you go because anything above 200 is going to have a massive impact. But usually 200 is the perfect balance between performance and how nice it looks. Hopefully by now you understand how you should post-process interior scenes. I want to give a huge shout out to all my patrons for sponsoring me this month and helping me do what I love, and especially to these top tier supporters: Avirama FM, Badr Al-Kahtani, Darkly NY, Giovanni Pena, Golden Glowmaster, Leonardo Pereira, and Xim369. To learn more about post-processing in general, I highly advise you to watch this video. And as always, thanks for watching.